Hello, Garland Nixon and Scott Ritter here with all kinds of big things going on in Ukraine. Scott just got back from Russia. Let's talk. Good morning, Garland Nixon and Scott Ritter here. Hey, just wanted to let you all know that we're going to get back to doing our Wednesday morning show. Unfortunately, we can't do it tomorrow morning, so we're here early. That's great. Don't forget, here's the rundown on this. This is my Rokfin exclusive show. Every week, Scott and I do an exclusive show on Rokfin for my premium members. Rokfin is great. It's my alternative platform. It allows you to, just in case they throw me off YouTube or something like that, or I get censored, you can go to Rokfin. It's uncensored, costs nothing to be a member. You can be a free member. However, if you choose to be a subscriber, it's $14.99 a month and like $12.40 something a month if you sign up for a year, because they give you 2 months free. So Scott and I are on. I do one show a week for my premium member. I do part of it on here, and that's with Scott Ritter. All right, Scott, couple of something I wanted to. You just got back from Russia, but I saw something, and very early in the conflict, one of the things you discussed was very early. One of the first people that talked about it was the political fallout. You had said things like, in the long run, I don't see how these governments can maintain, how they can stay in power. Just one thing I wanted to ask you about before we get into Ukraine, and that is there are articles now saying NATO wants to move, open a shop in Tokyo or something, so that now the North Atlantic shores apparently are in China. I don't know what the hell they're figuring that out. But bottom line is, Macron is saying no. Macron is coming out saying, hey, man, that ain't NATO. That ain't what we do. And I have to get the feeling, with all of the pushback that I've heard from particularly the business community, that he's speaking for a bloc. Your thoughts on that, Scott?
I agree totally. I mean, well, the French have long said, and when I say the French, I mean Macron. He's led the charge on this, that he doesn't want to see Europe turn into a battlefield between the United States and China. And that's not his goal. That's not his objective. It's not good for Europe. And in this, he's supported by, I would say, the realists of Europe, people who are affiliated with the industrial blocs, people who understand Chinese economy, and the role the Chinese economy plays in the global economy, and the absolute necessity of maintaining sound economic relations with China for the survival of the European economy, especially in a post-Ukraine conflict world where they have committed suicide from a energy security standpoint. So Macron is backed by this. Now he is facing off against what I'll call the lesser people of Europe, the political elite who owe their positions to their subservience to American policy objectives. And so these are the people that are actively articulating in favor of the expansion of NATO, and they're the ones who are buying into the American objective, because America is looking at China and recognizing that it doesn't have the best base of support in the Pacific. Many nations are looking at China, looking at America, seeing America in retrograde. And so the United States is trying to create the impression that it has far more support than it does. So that's why they're trying to link NATO, a North Atlantic treaty organization, to the Pacific, which is not the North Atlantic. And I also think it's a sign of desperation on the part of the United States and NATO. They're seeking relevance. They're seeking something to justify their continued existence. The NATO meeting, I believe next month in Vilnius, is going to be interesting, because the NATO is going to have to start to come face to face with the reality of Ukrainian defeat, which means a NATO defeat, how they react to that. Because rhetoric can only get you so far. At some point in time, rhetoric has to be turned into reality. And the reality of NATO is that while you can doctor the paperwork to make NATO look good on paper, it doesn't look good in reality. It's a very weak organization. The costs that are associated with building NATO up to the level that that many of these stooges of America claim it should be is prohibitive. Germany is an economy in recession. How do you transition from a recession economy where the very industrial base you need to build or rebuild a military has been gutted, shut down? They can't afford to produce the steel, the aluminum, the metals necessary for this. So Macron is on to something. I think this is the beginning of a growing movement in Europe to distance themselves from an expansive NATO. I think there is a desire in Europe right now to get down to the business of looking out for what's good for Europe, and what's good for Europe no longer automatically is connected to what's good for America.
I wanted to ask you this before we get certain. There's dams blown. There's all kinds of things going on. There's plenty to talk about. But before we get into that, I want to ask you about your trip, because I heard nothing but propaganda about Venezuela and South America, what have you. And then I had the opportunity to go to Venezuela, travel around, go out to little towns in the middle of nowhere, talk to the people. And I got a completely different perspective, not only on Venezuela, but on U.S. foreign policy and on the media and all of this kind of stuff, right? So even though I know you've traveled extensively throughout your career and you spent a significant amount of time in the Soviet Union, if you could tell us, was this kind of an eye-opening moment? What did you really learn from what did you pick up from your trip to Russia last month?
Well, first of all, we need to understand that while I spent 26 days in Russia, that's not enough. Right. Russia is a huge country. It's a very complicated country. So I'm not going to insult anybody, especially the Russian people, and say that I saw everything, I know everything, I'm all seeing, all knowing now, all wise about things Russia. If anything, this trip taught me that I know nothing about Russia, and therefore all these experts that are out there pontificating about Russia, they know nothing too. And that's my lesson to the American audience right here: is Russia is not what you're seeing on TV. Russia is not what you're reading. I was given a unique opportunity to visit 12 cities that encompassed the geographic width and breadth of Russia. My hosts were wonderful people who, when I met with Russians, I met with the highest quality Russians. And what I mean by that is when they wanted to give me an entree into a part of Russian society, I got the best ambassador of that part of Russian society to explain it to me, to be there, to tutor me. And so this was a huge educational opportunity. I can come out with certain takeaways. One, sanctions aren't working. Now, you and I have talked about this because sitting back here, looking at everything that we look at, the data that's coming out, it's just clear that the Russian economy continues to function and that the European economies are struggling. But to see it in person, to get off the airplane in Novosibirsk, which was my first city, the third largest city in Russia, with the fastest growing economy in Russia, and to understand what's behind this economic growth. One, the idea of isolating Russia has failed. Everybody's in Russia. Everybody's in Russia. Everybody's in Russia. Even the people we claim aren't in Russia, they're in Russia because Russia is thriving economically. It's a great place to invest. But the Chinese are in there in a big way. The Indians are there, the Pakistanis are there, and other people are there. Wink, wink, nod, nod. Because it's business, and business is good. But the most important thing about who's in Russia is Russia's in Russia. See, the United States has made a fatal mistake. We've talked about this before, about the role of the oligarchs. How we helped create an oligarch class in the 1990s that was so powerful that even a Vladimir Putin wasn't able to sweep them away. Instead, he had to make accommodations with them that allowed this oligarch class to not only continue to exist, but to thrive. And they were taking trillions of dollars of Russian wealth, and it was fleeing Russia. All those yachts, all the villas, all the investments that were made overseas. That was bad for Russia because the wealth of Russia is being stripped away and sent abroad, and it's not being put back into Russia. But because of sanctions, these oligarchs can't take their money anywhere. It has to stay in Russia, and they have to reinvestment in Russia. Russia is a nation. You know how Joe Biden had wanted to have this Build Back Better plan where we were going to have this $1 trillion infrastructure investment. We're going to build everything and all that, and it never happened because we don't have the money, et cetera. Well, Russia's got the money, and they are building back better. They have taken Joe Biden's concept, and they've turned it into reality. Everywhere you look in Russia, there's new construction, new bridges, new highways, new train stations, new metro stations, new everything. It's all being built. They have city planners now in certain areas who in the past, like any city, let's take the city of Albany. You read about it every year about the budget. We got our budget. Well, we can't give these people everything they want. We're not going to be able to do this. We have to cut back here to do this, that, and the other thing. And so what happens is you have a lot of people who don't get to do the projects they want to do. Right now in these cities, you have a budget where they go, how do we spend all this money? How do we spend all this money? They are actually calling people up saying, hey, we got 1 billion rubles we need to do something with. We need you to come in and do this project. And people are like, yeah, but I'm doing another project over here. I mean, this is, American city planners would beg for this kind of activity, and it's all because of the United States. Now, does this mean that the Russian economy is being managed perfectly? No. Like any time when you're flush with money, there's corruption, there's inefficiencies, there's inadequacies, there's just petty human stupidity, where bureaucrat X doesn't like bureaucrat Y, therefore nothing's going to get done. Does this exist in Russia? Hell yes, it does. Is it a problem? You're damn right it's a problem. Russia isn't perfect. Anybody who's listening to this thinking that, Ritter's drank the Kool-Aid and he's drunk on Putin. No, I'm not. I'm simply being honest with what I saw. I saw a nation undergoing a construction transformation. I also saw a nation struggling within itself, as any human-based society does. There are problems. It ain't perfect. There are things that can be done to be better. I would tell you this, if Russia actually got its act together in terms of the bureaucracy, the inefficiencies of the bureaucracy, the inherent corruption of a post-oligarch reality, it would be unstoppable. The potential for Russia is so much greater than the reality of Russia. And the reality of Russia is pretty good. They're doing okay. If you think we're going to beat Russia by imposing sanctions, you're wrong. Russia is doing well. The other thing is the level of patriotism. Some people, again, they when I say what I'm about to say, people are like, you're just naive, Scott. Pie in the sky moment, kumbaya, I want to hold hands, sing songs. Wow. But when I say I'm on the search for the Russian soul, that's serious, because the one thing I can take away is that there is a Russian soul. And if you don't understand it, you don't understand Russia. It's real. Now, how do you define it? It may not be able to be defined. That's sort of I'm trying my best. I've collected a lot of data. I'm thinking about it. I'm writing about it. But the conclusion I've reached so far is that you can't define the Russian soul. It's like defining God. What is God? It's this thing. It's this entity. It's there. But the moment you try to define it, you do it a disservice. What is the Russian soul? I think it's ever changing, ever evolving. It's part of Russia, but it unites all Russians. It's real. And anybody who thinks that we can break Russia through sanctions, through whatever we do. Let me say you this, the supporters of Navalny don't have a Russian soul. They're soulless people because they have forgotten what it means to be Russian. That doesn't mean that you have to support Vladimir Putin to be Russian. You don't. There is a lot of opposition to Vladimir Putin in Russia. I'll tell you that right now. Not because they hate Putin or hate Russia. They just aren't happy. The one thing I heard over and over again is, I have questions. I have a lot of questions for Vladimir Putin. I have questions about this. I have questions about that. That's a sign of a healthy society. This isn't lockstep, we're doing whatever Putin wants, but they're Russian. And Putin is the Russian leader right now. And if what we don't understand is, if we think that, if we overheard somebody ask questions, we go, oh, Putin's weak, we can exploit that, bring him down. Wrong answer. Because the Russian people are rallying around the Russian government in an existential conflict against the collective West. And coming to grips with that, what seems to be two contradictory things, potential dissatisfaction with the leadership, and yet the highest level of support, that the leadership has had. How do you bring those two things together? The Russian soul. The Russian soul brings it together, the essence of Russia. And we need to understand that, Americans, we're a soulless people. I don't mean that as an insult. What I mean is, who are Americans? I mean, the only true Americans are the American Indians, and we've spent decades, centuries slaughtering them and oppressing them. We put them on reservations, and we still treat them like absolute crap. They're the only ones who can say we have an American soul, because they're the only ones who have a distinct link to the essence of what America is. Everybody else is an immigrant. All right. And that's not bad. That means that when your parents arrive, you have a French soul, a German soul, an African soul, a Mexican soul, a Spanish soul. You're bringing in these experiences that when they come together, they don't come together to create a soul, because a soul is unifying. America has an ideal. America has a vision of freedom. I think freedom is a unifying factor, but it's imperfectly pursued. But that's why there's a difference between America and Russia. I'm not saying that one's better than the other. I like the concept of freedom. I like what America stands for. I don't like how we're doing it, but I like what we stand for. But I respect the Russian soul because I recognize that it exists. There's a lot of people who write about Russia who don't talk about this, who avoid it. The Michael McFalls, the Fiona Hills, the Angela Stentz, people of this nature. They write about Russia, and they try to talk about Russia as Putin, as an autocracy, as a soulless people who have married themselves. And you get it all wrong. Russia is Russia. Russia goes down from these people. It started from the very beginning when Kievan Rus was born, and they've gone through the transitions, through the Golden Horde. They've gone through the Tsarist period, the communist period, the post-communist period. All of this combines this history, this experience, this culture makes the Russian soul. And if you don't understand it, you'll never understand Russia. And that's my big takeaway, is the American people haven't a clue what they're talking about with Russia, because we try to examine Russia through an American prism, a prism of our own experience. But our experience is a soulless experience. Our experience is defined by an idea, by an ideal of freedom. And then we get frustrated when we look at Russia and we say, well, they don't share our values. Well, their values are defined differently. Their values are defined by what we call the Russian soul. Our values are defined by an ideal of freedom. It doesn't mean that they're incompatible, but it does mean that they're not one and the same. And if you're trying to evaluate one in a vacuum and just say, well, this is the American way of looking at it, now we examine Russia and we find Russia to be inadequate. That's just like a Russia looking and saying, this is the Russian way. And I found this a lot. This is the Russian way. And we look at America and we see that America is inadequate. Well, America may be inadequate from a Russian perspective, but it's pretty adequate from an American perspective, especially in what we claim to believe in: freedom, liberty, justice for all. These are concepts that are enshrined in the Constitution. But as Americans, well, I think the other thing I would ask Americans to do is please start falling in love with America as much as the Russians have fallen in love with Russia. The people I saw were patriotic. The people I saw believed in their country. The people I saw understood their country. They are enmeshed in the history and the culture of Russia. Even the average person on the street, if I pulled them aside and I said, let's talk about Dostoevsky, they will know who Dostoevsky is. They'll talk about Tolstoy. They'll talk about the poets, Pushkin, Lermontov. They'll talk about all of this. They'll be able to talk about the history. They have a grasp. They don't have PhDs, but I could go pull a combiner off of the mower that's taking down the grain in the Volgograd region and sit down and bring up Tolstoy. He'll know who Tolstoy is. I can go right now and grab an average American off the street and say, who is Emerson? Huh? Walt Whitman? Who? What about the great American poet Frost? Huh? Nothing there. Then we talk about the history. They don't know our history. So what we have is a nation of people who claim to embrace an idea, but we don't know how we got there. We don't know why it's not working, because it's not working, guys. It's not working. And to understand why it's not working, we have to understand who we are and what we are. And I would just ask, the lesson that I learned is that we need to start loving our country as much as the Russians love their country. And if we did that, if we embraced who we are, faults and all, we'd be better positioned to fix it. And why do I believe Russia is going to come out of this okay? Because this isn't about Putin. Putin is the leader today. He's 70 years old. Putin's going to be gone. Russia is forever. Russia doesn't end. Russia exists, and it's going to exist after Putin. And what's going to define the Russian existence post-Putin is the Russian soul. And we need to come to grips with that, because 10 years from now, Putin will probably not be in power. 80-year-old men shouldn't be leading nations. Hint, hint, America. But Russia will still exist. 10 years from now, Biden's not going to be there, but America's going to still exist. We have to stop looking at great nations like the United States and Russia in terms of individuals who are there through an accident of history. And we have to look at this in a broader way. And if we do that, we'll find there's actually a lot more in common than we think. And that this drift towards conflict is not only unnecessary, but tragic. We shouldn't be in conflict with Russia. There's no reason to be in conflict with Russia.
One other question that I'm curious about. Did you get any discussion or any information on, and this is something Americans don't even know. I have, Russian friends, lots of Russian friends who it's like their mother-in-law is their wife's half Ukrainian, their mother-in-law's in the Ukraine. Did you get any discussion about the ties between Russia and Ukraine, how the Russians see the Ukrainians as friends, as family members, blah, 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 and that dynamic?
100%. I mean, the bottom line is that the takeaway is if you rub a Russian, you get a Ukrainian. And if you rub a Ukrainian, you get a Russian. The two are the same. Every city I went, there's a huge Ukrainian population. Half the people I met said I was born in Ukraine, or my mother was born in Ukraine. The other half said, I have an uncle in Ukraine, I have a brother in Ukraine, I have a sister in Ukraine. You can't separate the two. Now, the more complicated discussion is the historical foundation of the Ukrainian state. What is Ukraine? What defines Ukraine? And here we get into a lot of nationalism and such. The Russians are quick to say and point out that, for instance, I've had this discussion with Anatoly Antonov, the Russian ambassador. He speaks about, the Metropolitan Museum of Art reclassifying what have long been considered Russian masterpieces, Russian artists, as now Ukrainian artists, because in 1848, when the artist was born, he was born in, Mariupol. And of course, the Ukrainians said, well, that's a Ukrainian city. But when he was born, it wasn't a Ukrainian city because Ukraine didn't exist. The notion of Ukraine didn't exist. The notion of a Ukrainian nation didn't exist. But you say that, but then you understand that today, the Ukrainians who are fighting right now um, they're fighting for Ukraine. So in their minds, Ukraine is a reality. And it's not just the Western Ukrainians that are fighting. There's people in Kiev who believe in the concept of a Ukrainian state. And so there's a fight for the history of Ukraine taking place right now in Russia. And it's a fight that I wish was being done with more historic accuracy and less national prejudice. There's a huge prejudice right now on both sides. You have the Ukrainians right now just trying to pretend Russia doesn't exist. Russia never existed. They're wrong. But you have some Russians that are doing the same thing to Ukraine, and therefore they're not respecting the fact that there are people in Ukraine who believe in this concept of a Ukrainian nation. But so, you have to push that aside. When you push that aside and get out of the politics of what the historical definition of Ukraine is, you get to the fact that Ukraine and Russia are the same damn thing, the same thing. I tell this story all the time. It's one that just breaks my heart. But Wagner surrounded a group of Ukrainian soldiers in Bakhmut, and they shouted in, "Surrender, brothers. We'll lay down your arms. We'll treat you okay. You'll live." And the Ukrainian soldiers shouted back, "Russians don't surrender." Now, that's a battle cry from World War II that was made famous by a Russian guy who ended up winning the hero of the Soviet Union. But the Germans said, "Surrender." He said, "Russians don't surrender." And they killed him. And of course, Wagner killed these guys. But the point being made is Russians are fighting Russians. That's a reality. Russians are fighting Russians. It's the same people. There might be politics aside. So this group of Russians call themselves Ukrainians, and this group of Russians call themselves Russians. But they're the same people. Again, we come back to what I said. You rub this person, this Russian, they become a Ukrainian. You rub this Ukrainian, they become a Russian. It's the same blood, the same people. And 30 years ago, they were marrying each other, living with each other in peace, working everywhere they wanted. The military, there's military officers today, colonels, who in the Russian army who served with colonels in the Ukrainian army as they entered together as captains, as majors. They fought together. They went to the same academies. But then in 1992, boom, it went away. You now have Ukraine and you now have Russia, and now they're at war. But understand, when they started their lives, they were the same people. They went to the same academy. They were fighting on the same side. They're best friends. And I have to tell you, military officers who go through the junior officer experience together, where everybody's, picking on you and sort of survival, you build this little mafia of lieutenants to survive. That's a bond that can never be broken. And so when we talk about a civil war right now, it is a real civil war. This is a civil war between Russians that's been promoted by the West. We've exploited some political differences to allow brother to fight brother, cousin to fight cousin, and it is one of the greatest tragedies of modern history.
Well, thanks a lot. Here's what we're going to do. We need to talk about what's going on. There's dams being blown. There's all kinds of things happening, some so-called offensive. So we're going to head on over, as I told everyone, that this is, in fact, my my weekly show for Rokfin subscribers. So I do one show a week for Rokfin subscribers. And even today, I showed half of it for everybody else, where we talked about the trip. Now we're going to talk about what's actually going on the battlefield. Please become a member on Rokfin. It is a great place. They don't have advertisements. They don't have they don't have any censorship. And of course, it costs nothing to join. You'll see all my videos except one weekly video. You're seeing half of that this week. One weekly video, which I do for my subscribers. And that's the one that Scott and I joined. So if you can afford to be a subscriber, $14.99 a month over at Rokfin. Thanks a lot, everybody. And we're heading over to Rokfin to talk with Scott about what's happening on the